Welcome, everybody. I'm Laura McClendon, Director of Land Conservation at Sempervirens Fund. Thank you for joining Under the Redwoods to explore the beauty, history, and science of redwood forests. We want to thank Scharf Investments for their sponsorship of this year's Under the Redwoods series. And thank you to Heritage Bank of Commerce for sponsoring this episode. You probably know that we like to think about redwoods as climate champions. One of their superpowers is the magnitude of carbon they store. As efforts to address climate change over the past few decades have included creation of carbon markets, that approach has seen its share of challenges, setbacks, and successes. But what is happening now? Here to answer that question and more is Dick Cameron, the Vice President of Science with Pachama. After nearly 2 decades at the Nature Conservancy, Dick recently joined Pachama to help the company harness AI and satellite data to empower companies to invest in nature. He is an expert in helping bringing technology and nature together at a critical time. We are grateful he is joining us today to help us understand how carbon markets are faring at a critical time. So please join me in welcoming Dick Cameron.
Thanks so much, Laura, and I look forward to the discussion. I'm going to present some slides in a little bit, and then we can have a discussion. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Excellent. Well, it's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation to speak to Sempervirens Fund. I've long been a fan of the organization, and as Laura mentioned, I spent almost 2 decades in California conservation restorations before going into a broader sort of climate tech and voluntary carbon market world. So glad to be back within this community and share some of the work that I've been doing the last couple of years. So as I think about climate change solutions and talk about climate change solutions, I like to put it in the context of what actually drives climate change and what emissions and what sources are actually contributing to climate change in the world. And this chart does a really nice job. It's published by the IPCC, the authoritative intergovernmental panel that works on climate change. And you can see the different drivers. So the blue, navy blue, represents kind of traditional emissions from the human economy, from buildings, from electricity, from transportation, and how those have increased from 1990 to 2019. The green line is land use change, deforestation, primarily in the tropics. And amazingly, it's anywhere from 10 to 15% of global emissions over this time frame, 11 to 13, but different estimates give it about 10 to 15. And then methane, shown here in yellow, is a sizable source as well. Methane has a higher global warming potential than CO2 in the sense that 1 ton of methane warms the atmosphere more, but it also stays in the atmosphere less time. So reducing methane emissions is a critical strategy. Much of the methane emissions, particularly in a place like California, come from agricultural manure management, things like that. But there's also natural sources of methane, such as freshwater wetlands and the soils. Nitrous oxide emissions are primarily coming from agricultural fertilizers. So if you think about putting the green, it's kind of a yellow color, and the orange together, that's almost 35% of emissions are coming from land use change, deforestation, and agriculture. So a huge opportunity to change practices there, to change policies, and to reduce emissions. And just for context, California, even though it's the 5th, 6th largest economy in the world, is about 0.5% of global emissions. Granted, that doesn't take into account the emissions that we demand on other places that produce the goods that we consume here. But in terms of our direct emissions, it's about that amount. And we know that we're going to have to drastically reduce emissions to avoid a future without catastrophic impacts. And so this chart in the upper right does a nice job with that by showing the teal color represents the magnitude of emissions, both in terms of when they peak and how quickly they need to be reduced by 2050 and the mid part of the century to avoid that catastrophic future. This is a future of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is quite ambitious at this point. But you can see the slope of that line, particularly the dark navy line there, is incredibly ambitious. What we talk about when we talk about net zero, what that means is that we're reducing emissions steeply until the middle part of the century, 2050. And then for any residual emissions left over in the economy, we're implementing removal technologies. So we're actually sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere to compensate for those residual emissions at that point in the next couple decades. And you can see that band of green represents negative emissions or removals. And so we know we're going to need anywhere from 10 to 15 gigatons annually of removals. And that obviously is dependent upon how quickly we can reduce emissions. Removals can come from an engineered source. This is an image of a direct air capture machine. These are essentially large vacuums that suck out the CO2 out of the atmosphere and put that carbon dioxide into long-lived materials. And then trees are a carbon removal technology as well. So we're going to talk a lot about the benefits of nature-based solutions in the context of climate change. And so we know there's no path to global net zero without protection and restoration of forests, grasslands, wetlands, other ecosystems, because we know that deforestation, as I talked about, is a big driver of emissions, and the opportunity to reduce emissions and to create removals from reforestation, from wetland restoration, from other types of ecosystem restoration activities is huge. So a study in 2017 led by Bronson Griscom at the Nature Conservancy entitled Natural Climate Solutions was one of the seminal papers in this whole field of how do you fight climate change with ecosystems? And they looked at different pathways. If you can protect, manage, and restore different ecosystem types, you can draw down or you can prevent the emissions from these different activities. You know, it's cheaper to protect than to restore an ecosystem. So avoiding those impacts in the first place is one of the most cost-effective ways to do so. They found that roughly 30% of the emissions that we need to meet the Paris Agreement could come from these interventions. Granted, that paper is now 7 years old. So, so this work is critical, and the work that Pachama does builds on a lot of this foundational science. And this is another chart from the IPCC, and what we know is that nature-based solutions, or these natural climate solutions, are both scalable and relatively cost-effective compared to that direct air capture machine that sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere. You can get, you know, reforestation removals much cheaper. And this chart does a really good job of that. I highlighted the areas that I've been talking about in that the red dashed line. So reduced conversion of forest and other ecosystems is preventing deforestation, obviously. The magnitude of the benefit is huge. You know, it's on par with wind and solar energy deployment across the globe. And then ecosystem restoration, you could see as darker red colors, meaning that it's more expensive and overall has a little bit lower potential, even though there's higher uncertainty around that estimate. Notably, wind and solar energy there in blue is to say that those are now return on investment positive. They are now in many places the cheapest source of electricity. So really successful story there. And obviously, we're not just talking about carbon. Protecting forests is protecting, you know, livelihoods for people, for biodiversity, ecosystem services, the social, cultural, economic benefits that we get from intact ecosystems are many in forest, including clean water, habitat, carbon storage, disturbance regulation, those sorts of things. So there's many other reasons to ensure that we're protecting and restoring forests. So generally speaking, like, we know what to do. We know that we need to increasingly decarbonize electricity, transportation, buildings. Cement, for example, is about 8% of global emissions, just cement production. Protecting and restoring nature. Hopefully now you understand why that's a big opportunity to fight climate change. Stopping methane emissions. Methane emissions, as I mentioned, are particularly important for avoiding peak warming in the next couple of decades because of the global warming potential of the gas. And then agriculture, a huge source of emissions, both in terms of tilling soil, in terms of operational footprint of tractors and other processing technology. So we know generally kind of what the big levers are to reduce emissions. The challenge is really how to pay for it. And this is something that I've worked on in different ways over my career, is like, how do you scale these things? One way would be through philanthropy. Obviously, foundations and corporate, you know, foundations represent an opportunity to fund pilot programs and deployment of activities that create these benefits. Government programs, we saw huge benefits going into renewable energy development, especially during the Obama administration, for example, to scale climate solutions. private sector investment, either directly in terms of supporting projects or in terms of their corporate policies. For example, many companies around the world, particularly in Europe, are looking at their supply chain and the impacts of their supply chain for goods and services on ecosystems. And then environmental markets. Environmental markets are not really broadly understood, but essentially that's what the world that we operate in the voluntary carbon market. I may use the acronym VCM. That's what that means. Environmental markets are essentially just a way to trade units of conservation or restoration of ecosystems. So you've probably heard of wetland mitigation markets. So if someone wants to build their house and they want to fill in an acre of wetland, they have to compensate, they have to mitigate for that impact by protecting or restoring wetlands elsewhere. That's an example of a market. So wetland mitigation markets, we also have endangered species markets in the United States, and we have carbon markets. So it essentially tries to put a price on that value of protecting and restoring carbon in ecosystems. So how do credits get created? There's a lot of confusion about what carbon credits are, how they're used, are they greenwashing? It's really important to understand the basis for what a credit represents. A lot of people think, oh, I own 100 acres of forest and that forest is growing. I should be able to sell a credit off that, right? And really the challenge is you only get credit for what you do above and beyond what would normally happen, or what would have been your sort of baseline or business as usual scenario. So I'll go through a couple examples here. So I'm going to focus on forests. So there's three ways primarily in which you can generate a credit in a forest ecosystem in a carbon market. One is plant a tree, plant a forest, do afforestation or reforestation to create forest cover in that place, quantify how those trees are growing and relate that to the carbon storage and sell those credits. Another one is what we call avoided deforestation. You'll often hear the acronym RED, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, which is essentially protecting a forest that's threatened to be cut down. And the basis for the crediting there is the difference between the forest as cut down and the emissions from that deforestation activity compared to the carbon stock in that standing forest. So companies, landowners, indigenous communities can develop a project if there's a demonstrated risk and generate credits that way. In California, our most common type is improved forest management. And this is really the type that's most common in the Redwood region, particularly. And that's essentially changing management regimes in a working forest, in a forest that's producing wood products, for example. The chart on the right does a really nice job of illustrating how, in an improved forest management context, credits are created. And so again, you only get credit for what's above and beyond either a sort of financial business as usual or a legal business as usual. And so the way to look at this chart is the green and the dashed orange lines starting at the same value. You know, the orange dash is essentially business as usual. So the forest grows a little bit, you have a harvest event as shown by this vertical line. You let the tree grow, let the forest grow a little bit, and you have another harvest event, let it grow, have another harvest event. Effectively, you're at zero. So you started here and you ended here. You didn't accumulate any carbon. That's what we would think of as the baseline or the business as usual. And then for a project activity, for a carbon project itself, you start at the same level, but you let that forest grow for longer. And you only have one harvest event. So this is an example of deferred harvest, or delayed harvest, where you let the forest grow that much more and you harvest less. And over time, you've accumulated a good bit of carbon. And the difference is this shaded area. So this shaded area over time represents the accumulated credits that you can generate through improved forest management. I know there's a lot of Redwood fans in the room, so I wanted to make sure I related some data on tree growth rates to what is known in Redwood regions. This isn't quite a great one-to-one comparison, but the main chart here on the back shows the above ground biomass shown in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare per year. A hectare is about 2.5 acres. It's 100 meters by 100 meters. So the light green line is the above ground, the dark green is below ground. And I looked at one paper by Steve Sillett and colleagues from 2020 looking really at old growth forests. So this is where these are fast growth rates at new trees and using redwood rates from older forests. Some of the highest number that he put in his paper was about 35 tons of CO2e per hectare per year. And that's just above ground live. But that's an extremely high end number. I've never really seen a number that high, but again, these are massive, as folks know, the size of the trees at that later stage in development can pack on a lot of carbon. 18 tons per hectare was the low end estimate. So I put those lines, so you could see them comparison to eucalyptus, to teak, to other broadleafs. This paper did a nice job of characterizing different growth rates. But as Laura touched on, redwoods really, the growth rate is high, but the storage is off the charts. And the storage is because they live, millennia. So the fact that they're living, 2000 years, roughly, I'm not sure exactly, but accumulating the growth over that time frame, having all the dead material that accumulates in the forest, it can store as over 8,000 tons of CO2e per hectare. And CO2e is just to say carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare. So I looked at some numbers of Sumatran peat forest. Peat soil is very carbon rich, and it was roughly 2 times the storage scale of that type of forest. So redwoods obviously are climate change champions. And not surprisingly, there are a number of improved forest management projects. This is a screenshot from the Climate Action Reserve. Most of these are improved forest management compliance projects, which means they're feeding into the cap and trade program in California, the regulatory carbon market, as opposed to the voluntary carbon market. So a lot of folks, I think, think of carbon offsets, something like the indulgences during in the Catholic Church, for example, or, if you just buy credits, you don't need to reduce emissions. So I wanted to put using credits or using offsets in the context of climate action among, what are sort of the corporate leaders out there. And so the first step that you really want to take on is getting a handle on your inventory. Where are you emitting greenhouse gases from? Is it from electricity, from transportation, from your supply chain, things like that? And once you've got your inventory done and you know how many greenhouse gas emissions you're causing, you can report that, and then you can set a target. You can say, okay, we want to be 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, and we're going to switch to electrified vehicles. We're going to buy renewable energy. We can do a bunch of different activities to do that. The best companies, the climate leaders, are both decarbonizing and compensating for those residual emissions that they have after they've reduced their emissions themselves by buying carbon credits. And there's high quality credits and there's low quality credits. Like any market, you're going to have a variety of different quality, products out there in the market. And so once companies compensate and buy credits, they could either do that through nature-based solutions supporting reforestation, or they could support deployment of renewable energy or cook stoves or other technologies that can reduce emissions and provide benefits to people. Then they can make claims. They can say, we're carbon neutral this year or whatever it might be. And then they can educate, join alliances, and talk about their impact. And so this is really how credits figure into the whole, we call it a climate action flywheel for corporate leaders in the voluntary carbon market. But obviously, there's a lot of concern. There's a lot of critiques. There's a lot of people that feel like, there's no place to put a price on nature, put a price on carbon. We just have to protect it for its inherent rights. There are projects that have been exposed as being fraudulent. I'm not here to say that all carbon projects are perfect and don't have issues, but there are good projects to invest in. And so we've obviously been living within this world of negative media and sort of helping people parse good projects from challenging projects. And I would just say that there's a lot of critiques against companies, even if they're taking action. If they don't take action that is not perfect, or somehow the projects that they invested in have issues later on, they get critiqued more than the companies that are doing absolutely nothing. And that's a really bad situation, because all that does is delay climate action, delay investment in important things, and also scare companies that want to get involved and want to make a commitment to climate. They don't want to get involved because they're going to get criticized. And so this is a situation where we've been actively promoting the need to bring integrity, transparency, use algorithmic methods and science methods to improve the integrity within the voluntary carbon market more broadly. And I'll talk about some of the ways in which we're doing that. One of the primary ways is sort of evolving the way that we measure carbon and the way we measure change in carbon in a forest from more traditional methods, such as field-based inventories that get recorded in spreadsheets, that get turned into PDFs, that get calculated through somewhat bespoke subjective calculations, to something that's more of like an enterprise accounting system, something that has more automation, more dynamism, and more objectivity. And we can use satellite imagery. We can use things like LiDAR, which is now in a lot of vehicles that we drive, to help quantify carbon in ecosystems. And that can be, it's not to say that you don't then need to go into the forest. You still need to invest in field work, and you still need to have plots to be the basis for our models, but we can increasingly use modeling and use satellite imagery to do those estimations to help improve the transparency and objectivity of the accounting. A number of companies that I'm sure you're familiar with work with us. They like the fact that we have a very rigorous due diligence process where we look at the actual climate benefit of projects and help them understand what makes a good carbon project. We do a lot of educational work, a lot of support as they get on their climate action journey. As I mentioned, we use satellite imagery. So I'll talk about how we approach this for different projects, but we have a quality standard where we look at, how's the project doing relative to other control areas, similar to a medical trial. That gives us a strong basis for understanding what climate impact a project actually is having. A lot of companies also want to invest in nature. There's increasingly a lot of support for biodiversity conservation, restoration, supporting ecosystems that support people. And so we provide projects that are primarily focused on native species reforestation or protection of primary forests. And that gives companies an opportunity to align their sort of nature investment strategy with their climate strategy. And then we try to, provide live feeds of information. This is an image of a jaguar getting some water out of a stream in one of the projects that we supported in Brazil. And a lot of the case for sustainability funding is obviously, climate strategic climate investment, but it's also the stories around the carbon. Carbon itself is not very charismatic, but jaguars are. So we bring a lot of what we think of as sort of due diligence and value to the transaction process. Briefly on our quality standard, we've roughly passed about 30% of the projects that we evaluate. So we do find a lot of projects don't meet our criteria. We're looking for things that are truly additional. So you remember that chart where we saw that green shaded area. We really want to make sure that the actual climate benefit of these projects is real. Conservative accounting is one of the principles there that provides that benefit, making sure that you don't overstate the benefit that you're getting. Durability is a big issue. Obviously, forests burn down, pests, pathogens affect forests. So does the project implement activities which reduce risk from fire or pests or pathogens, for example, and are they providing for that opportunity for durability over time? And then beyond carbon is just to indicate that we're looking for projects that provide benefits not only to ecosystems, but to human communities and to residents far away in cities in terms of water quality and things like that. So our quality standard is how we sort of parse, the high excellent quality projects from those that are not quite as good. So getting into some of the technology and some of the science, you could think about simple carbon accounting as your total credits, what happens in your project minus what happens in that baseline. So you have to subtract out what would have happened normally, and only the difference between the baseline and the project is what you can credit against. Leakage is just the emissions that can be caused from implementing a project in one place and displacing an agricultural activity to another place. So you're essentially squeezing that balloon and causing emissions elsewhere by changing that. So there has to be strategies to avoid leakage, for example. But if you think of it in terms of spatial data, GIS data, remote sensing, we can quantify carbon storage. We can map forest cover, so what's 30% or higher canopy cover, for example. And then we can characterize what's going on in the baseline. So those are three core data inputs into this simplified carbon accounting process. One of the main things is, how is forest changing over time? What's the carbon storage over time? How is that changing? So we're developing models that use, I mentioned LiDAR. LiDAR is just basically lasers from drones, airplanes, or from satellites. And those lasers get shot down at the top of the forest, and they get fed back to the sensor, and the sensor is able to determine the height of whatever it hits. So whether it's bare ground or trees, it can give you an estimate of height. So we're developing models trained on airborne LiDAR because it's higher density, higher quality information to train a model. So you can see here, areas in green represent the canopy of the forest, whereas areas in blue represent no trees, for example. So we train the model. This is a central part of the Amazonian part of Brazil and Pará state. And we integrate the airborne LiDAR, which is the laser shot from the planes, with space-based LiDAR, so satellite-based LiDAR. And through an integration process and calibrating those data sets, we can come up with reasonable level of accuracy, but more importantly, communicate the uncertainty and the accuracy of our estimates so that there is that transparency in the market. Canopy height, the reason we do that is because it's detectable from satellites, and it's a good indicator of carbon storage. There's equations to be able to translate to carbon storage. So we integrate those LiDAR training flights. And so what you're seeing here, these things that look like little worms, are actually transects of the planes flying the LiDAR sensor over. And this is just to show our sort of test and training split. We take some of the data and train the model, and some of the data and test how well it did. We also integrate other information, other satellite information, and develop. This is where the AI and the machine learning comes in. We develop a model that integrates all this information and provides those canopy height estimates each year. And so that's the real opportunity. Here's what that looks like in this part of Pará, Brazil. You can see a pattern of deforestation along probably a river, maybe a road, probably a road actually, in this part of the world. And areas in yellow represent higher forests. So it really picks out some fine-grained patterns that are helpful for quantifying carbon change. At a very different scale, at the scale of like an individual farm, we can fly LiDAR from a drone. So we're much closer, we can have a higher density signal, and we can make images like this by combining that LiDAR with a traditional aerial photo. So this is a three-dimensional, kind of looks like a picture from a plane, but it's actually a digital representation, combining that LiDAR with the aerial photo. So from 2022 to 2023 on this farm in Brazil, you can see the growth of shrubs and saplings. And so it provides a really high density, high accuracy set of information. This obviously is not scalable because the cost and the time to fly a drone is not something you can do across millions of acres. So we take that information that comes from the drone sensor, and then we create these canopy height models. You can see here what a 1 meter resolution. So each pixel here is 1 meter on a side, out to a 30 meter, where each pixel is 30 by 30 meters. And you can see that over that increasing resolution, you lose, or decreasing resolution, you lose the ability to resolve individual tree canopies. But this is essentially the workflow that we're implementing to be able to quantify carbon at this fine scale. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like, so here's a transect, of this, sort of like an elevation profile on a hiking map. This line here is represented by these scatter plots. And so you can see, this is a 1.5 meter tree versus a 2 meter tree. And so there's very sort of fine scale ability to resolve forest structure with a data set like this. Increasingly, folks on this call may have worked with this terrestrial laser scanning, TLS. It's essentially ground-based LiDAR. So you have a laser, you shoot it cross-section through the forest, and you can generate images like this, which are pretty mind-blowing, because what this gives us the ability to do is not estimate the carbon, but actually, quantify the volume of the tree in terms of branches and in terms of stem. And this is some of the work that I believe Steve Sillett and colleagues are doing out of Humboldt State to do these, 3D models of redwood trees. Are pretty mind-blowing, but that technology is now becoming more common in other ecosystem types. So finally, I'm just going to touch on one of the ways that we determine the climate benefit of projects. So I've talked a lot about additionality. I've talked about how we approach judging climate benefits similar to a medical trial. We call this our dynamic control area baseline. So I talked about a baseline, again, as representing what would have happened without the project. So it's sort of the business as usual without a carbon project. But because that's a hypothetical, you can't necessarily observe what would have happened. You have to have some basis for comparison, so some experiment here. So what we do is we look at, we use satellites to look at patterns of deforestation, both within and outside the project. So here, let's say this project in white is somewhere in the Amazon rainforest, And we want to select a control area. So again, our control area represents sort of that placebo taking control population in the experiment. It's the places without the carbon project. And so those are represented here by these yellow pixels. So they're similar in terms of factors that affect deforestation, such as distance to recent deforestation, not surprisingly, things like slope and elevation, tree cover density, ecoregion type, tree productivity. And so comparing like for like, both within the project and outside the project, gives us the ability to estimate how many avoided emissions or what climate benefit did that project have. And so this is just a neat illustration to show that in those control areas, in those yellow pixels, we can look at deforestation over time, quantify how much happened in those control pixels as compared to the project itself. And again, the difference is the actual climate benefit. So those red areas within those yellow pixels shown here as the baseline trend in the yellow, and then the project itself shown here in blue. So again, sort of mimicking that chart that I showed earlier, the yellow shaded area represents the amount of climate benefit or the amount of credits that could be generated from a project like this. And the reason that this is important is because it takes carbon accounting out of the hypothetical and the theoretical, right? It takes it from, it used to be, we're going to guess as to what the rate is, and we're going to, use historical trends and project those out into the future and assume that that rate is the same going forward. Now we don't need to make that guess. We can basically look retrospectively at what actually happened and quantify that carbon benefit empirically, or that climate benefit empirically. So in summary, hopefully now you understand the importance of protecting and restoring nature, obviously for many reasons, but also for climate change. And ensuring that we manage forests in a way that keeps carbon out of the atmosphere, but also maintains ecological resilience is a critical aspect of nature-based solutions. Credits are really one way that companies can take responsibility for their emissions, but they can, there's other strategies that are necessary. But credits designed well and implemented well can support communities and nature. And technology advances can really help improve the transparency, the integrity within the market that we exist in, so that buyers are clear about what they're getting and sellers are able to provide enough transparency so that there's trust among all stakeholders. And it's not perfect, it's not there yet, it's definitely a work in progress, but we are committed to making sure that we can do our part to see that happen. So thank you very much. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dick. That was very interesting. And I loved all of the graphics, especially all of the LiDAR. And we at Sempervirens and many conservation groups use geospatial information to help guide our land management and land protection decisions. So the better this technology becomes, the better our work becomes altogether. I want to get into a few questions. First, just questions I have, and then we'll get to the audience questions. So given how much redwoods have in terms of potential to store carbon, it seems obvious that you should target all of them for some kind of carbon project. That said, can you give a little bit of an overview to your understanding of how redwoods have been involved in carbon markets to date, and how effective it's been in protecting them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of redwoods, as I mentioned with that map and the Climate Action Reserve, a lot of the sort of working forest, the redwood forest, Douglas fir forest in the coastal region of California that are in sort of timber production or wood products production, many of those are, not many, but some are enrolled in carbon projects. Mm-hmm. And by changing the harvest regime and changing the frequency and timing and the amount of the harvest that happens, they can generate credits. Again, the thing to think about is that really creating a climate benefit compared to a place that didn't have that carbon project? And so a lot of it's important to distinguish what could be your baseline versus what would actually be your baseline. And what I mean by that is, one way to develop a carbon project is by assuming that you would legally maximize the legal amount of harvest that you could do, even though that may not be commonly done. And the way we would look at a project like that is, they should really be judged based on how they're doing relative to to properties that are not enrolled, rather than how they're doing relative to theoretically what they could harvest.
Yeah, so a little bit more of a reality check in terms of business as usual, rather than what's the worst thing that could happen versus what's the most likely negative thing that could happen.
Yeah, and that's where
That
like a dynamic baseline, you can observe what would have happened. So you can say, okay, we're going to match this property with another property that's similar, but not in a carbon project, and observe what happens there. So.
Do you have an idea of like how carbon markets can be used to protect redwoods broadly in our either in our region or the entire redwood region?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some opportunities for that avoided conversion.
Mm,
That's a project type that you can develop in California where maybe at smaller scales, there's a development proposal or a mine or some sort of land use that's proposing to remove redwood forests. That would be a project where you protect that forest and you can generate credits from that. I think the reforestation is essentially going to be an opportunity. Can you accelerate reforestation than it would have happened normally? Again,
mm.
because you're only getting credits above and beyond that baseline, you have to do something that stabilizes the soil, that increases the survival rate of seedlings and saplings. And so that may be an opportunity as well in certain parts of the redwood range. And then probably the biggest is that improved forest management. But what becomes kind of weird is that if you have enough enrollment in carbon projects, then that becomes common practice. That becomes actually
Oh,
baseline.
yeah.
So you've got this point at which you have to think about, at some point, deployment and expansion of carbon projects becomes almost self-limiting because they become the way that it's normally done, and they don't realize any sort of above and beyond benefit.
So given that, if you take that out to like, logical conclusion of if you're so successful, you've enrolled every acre of forest, obviously this is a kind of a pipe dream, but acre of forest in carbon projects, across California, say, and it's all improved forest management. How might carbon markets either further those efforts or be hindered by that success?
Yeah, I mean, it would be it's a kind of thing you would love to see, but it would sort of be the end of the carbon market in some ways, potentially, in the sense that the carbon market the voluntary carbon market was meant to be a bridge to a real price on carbon in the economy. And that's happened in California, that's happened in some states around the US and in other parts of the world. But it would be a great outcome for climate, but it would essentially create a situation in which your ability to generate credits from those activities is reduced. So I guess it would sort of reduce the environmental market benefit itself, but would represent some measure of success in the end because you've seen the deployment of activities that increase carbon on the landscape.
Hmm. Are there certain policies, either at the state level or US level or even in other countries that are either helping carbon markets, forced carbon markets work or not?
Yeah, one of the things that's going on around the world is sort of the merging of the voluntary carbon market where corporations are purchasing credits with the Paris Agreement. So countries are setting targets in terms of their protection and restoration of forests, and ultimately going to hopefully generate credits and enter a trading market between countries to help them meet their goals. And so those sorts of policies at the international level are providing an opportunity to drive funding both from governments and corporations into protection of rainforests around the world. It's somewhat new. It's kind of just now kind of becoming the first examples of that at a big scale are starting to happen. So those are some examples of, I guess, multilateral policies. And then other policies, through the Farm Bill or through the Inflation Reduction Act, there's essentially programs within USDA or Department of Interior that support farmers, forest landowners to do restoration activities to improve carbon in the soil, to manage their forest differently, to protect forests and put a conservation easement on it that provide, innumerable benefits to climate and to communities. So
So,
that's an example of a federal one. And then obviously California is leading the way in its natural and working lands
right.
climate policy. So that's another example.
And if you had a magic wand and you could enact one policy to help further the work of Pachama and the protection of forests through carbon markets, what would that policy be?
I mean, a price on carbon ultimately. I think like having really the voluntary carbon market does what it can to price a ton of
Mm-hmm.
carbon, not emitted to the atmosphere in terms of its impact today and in the future. But really, that price is far too low based on studies that we know in terms of this idea of social cost of carbon, which is the cost of a ton emitted today in terms of its impact on future generations and the economy. So that would be, at a national level, definitely a pipe dream at this point, but it would be something that would drive a lot of investment, both in terms of decarbonizing the, electricity, transportation sector, but also investing in ecosystems.
Yeah. So the idea of in carbon markets, I mean, central is putting a price on carbon, something that exists everywhere, and especially in organic material. But as we know, ecosystems provide more than just carbon storage. How do carbon markets account? You touched on a little bit of this, but how do they really account for and enforce kind of a holistic approach and towards nature protection, nature-based solutions? And like, can you see ways that they could be strengthened to better protect, water quality, wildlife, and such?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of it happens through what we call labels. So essentially, to get a carbon credit approved, you have to follow a methodology. Those methodologies are published by these entities called registries or standards. So Verra is one standard that's common. The Climate Action Reserve is another standard. American Carbon Registry. They all have ways of approaching carbon credit creation. And in there are baseline, things that guard against, affecting communities negatively, causing
Mm-hmm.
human rights abuses, causing adverse environmental impacts, for example. You don't want, there are rules, for example, you can't have reduced the forest 10 years before you implement a reforestation activity because you don't want someone cutting down their forest and then planting trees and getting credits from it. So there's basic rules
Definitely
like
wouldn't
that.
want that.
Sounds like a good idea, right? And so there's basic rules like that, but then there are other additional labels, additional certifications that a
Yeah.
carbon project can do. One is, CCB label. I think it's community conservation biodiversity, um, community climate biodiversity. But essentially, it has a number of things that you need to monitor, things you need to track, and they're more in terms of impacts on communities, impacts on ecosystems. Forest Stewardship Council also has some integration with the carbon market as well. So that's how sort of additional co-benefits come into projects, and often companies will pay for that. So they'll pay more for a credit because it has this additional certification through CCB or whatever label might be.
That's really great. And how with the projects Pachama is involved in, how much of your projects do incorporate those co-benefits?
Yeah, a lot of the projects that we are developing ourselves include primarily native species. So we had an initial threshold of 95%. We'll probably have a little bit more flexibility on a number like that, but predominantly native species that are, seeds collected from the region that are climate adapted, that, we're sure are going to thrive and provide habitat in that place. We also look for parts of the landscape that can connect protected areas or provide riparian buffers. So they have water quality benefits, wildlife connectivity benefits. And obviously we involve the communities. So where a project is happening, it's not just the landowner that we consult with. There's a process of engaging neighbors and other stakeholders to ensure that there's no negative impact caused by that project. So those are some of the ways in which we, in terms of where we do projects and how we do projects, provide benefits.
Fascinating. So I want to ask a little bit more about maybe some of the more technical things. A lot of the high cost of doing carbon projects, forest carbon projects, comes down to measuring the forest carbon. And a lot of that up until recently has been boots on the ground, doing sample plots and scaling that up to get a carbon accounting for a whole forest. It's very expensive, as you know, and precludes a lot of smaller landowners, forest landowners from the market itself. How are emerging technologies lowering those costs? And if you could just speak a bit more to that, especially around LiDAR and other geospatial technology.
Yeah, so I talked about how field plots, to get a measurement of the diameter of a tree, you have to be down on the ground measuring that, but you can do fewer field plots if you fly LiDAR, for example, and achieve the same level of accuracy in terms of the overall inventory, because you're creating that wall-to-wall measure of that canopy height. So presumably that would reduce costs. You have to have fewer people in the field for less time by reducing that. But you touched on the question of property size, and that's a huge driver, particularly in California. So now there are methodologies that let you aggregate multiple landowners into one project. And so essentially you can add, as you get more interested landowners, you can add them into the project over time, and they can implement the activity, and then you gradually expand. And that also provides a sampling benefit, because you can stratify across multiple properties and have same level of inventory accuracy for less effort. So those two aspects are helpful.
And what do you think is going to be the kind of tipping point to really having those kind of aggregated smaller projects taking off in a really meaningful way? Because we have Sempervirens has looked into this issue a lot, and because our properties and the lands throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains are so fragmented, it is hard to get to a scale that justifies the cost of doing inventory to produce the credits, among some other challenges. But it seems that aggregation of many smaller properties is a solution. We just haven't gotten there quite yet in terms of scale. And I don't know if you have new insights from recent years in the aggregation world.
Not really, not in terms of any like quantitative threshold that would make a difference. It's really a question of like looking at the cost of implementing the activity, of developing the documents, of doing all the methodological heavy lifting that is required for a carbon project relative to the price of carbon. And obviously that's been jumping around a good bit the last couple of years in the voluntary market, because you have people moving away right now from the avoided deforestation or those red credits, because they've been in the news more. And the way it happens is pretty simple. Some leadership in a company sees an article that's critical of a project, they talk to their sustainability people, and often there's a retreating that's going on. There's a reduction of activity and commitment, because they want to stay out of the paper, that understandably they don't want to get in trouble. And that's frankly why we've been able to be successful and be helpful in this market, is by helping them, sort of being a partner with them to help them understand what makes a good project versus a not great project. But yeah, that price is really critical to understanding how scalable that aggregation of smaller properties is.
So fire is obviously on the top of many people's minds, especially in the West. And I just want to share a little bit more about how wildfire is accounted for in forest carbon. And, does it mean we shouldn't do any projects where there are fires, or how should we approach that with forest projects?
Great question. Yeah, and in fires in the West, obviously we had decades, if not a century, of fire suppression was sort of the predominant management, regime in the land. And what that did is allow fuels to accumulate. You combine that with adding 40 million people in the case of California, as well as climate change. So climate change dries out fuels faster, and when fires burn, the fuels are more explosive, because the fuels are that much drier. And so we need to find ways to restore good fire to the landscape, and ensure that fire can happen in landscapes and burn at a level of intensity that's restorative and that's regenerative and not harmful. And so that's really the challenge. And the way the carbon markets account for that is they'll include a buffer. So you quantify how much carbon accumulates in the trees that you grow, and then you remove out anywhere from 15 to 30% of those credits and hold them aside in case there's some event such as a fire.
Like a risk pool, essentially,
Yeah, exactly.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's your own self-imposed. It's not self-imposed because it's required in terms of the methodology, but it's an insurance pool that you can pay back if you can use that to pay back your credits if you do have a fire, things like that. The one thing there is that component. There's also an emerging type of carbon project that I hope we'll see in the coming years, which is getting paid to do restorative actions to reduce severity if a fire does happen. So
Explain a little more. Yeah.
yeah, you could think of this as basically avoiding the emissions associated with a high severity event, a high severity fire, by having done activities to reduce that high severity before. So reducing, ladder fuels and doing all the sorts of forest treatments that are happening around the state. The way that you could approach that is similar to how I described that dynamic baseline, where you can select similar properties that didn't do that restorative action, experienced a fire, and you could quantify how high, relatively high severity that fire was versus what happened in the project. And so statistically, if you have enough fire events across a large enough area, you can actually develop a comparative approach that could reward landowners and, maybe even the government in some way to do those restorative actions. So I'm really excited about the promise of that. A lot of people have been talking about it for a while. It's difficult to make the accounting work because the first restoration action removes biomass. So it removes carbon out of the forest, and you have to account for that. So it only works in a place where you're having frequent large intensity fires. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. So we only have a few minutes left, and we have a few questions that have come in. So I'm going to invite my colleague Matt to join. We'll hear his voice, and he'll ask a few questions from the audience for you, Dick.
This has been terrific. Thanks so much for this. We've gotten lots of really great, engaging questions, some of which you've answered. I wanted to jump back to baselines, and I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more, or maybe re-describe how organizations, companies, landowners are effectively determining and verifying baseline carbon emissions in order to participate meaningfully in voluntary carbon markets.
Yeah, so I think baseline is essentially you have to, when you develop your project, you have to state, we're going to do these 3 actions. And these 3 actions represent a difference from what we're legally required to do. So obviously you don't get credit for what you legally have to do anyway. It's not the most financially attractive, so you don't get credit for doing something that's going to make you the most money anyway. And so you have to develop a number of checks. There's legal additionality checks, which is sort of, again, asking that question, would it have happened because of legal or regulatory requirements? There's financial additionality questions. But essentially, that dynamic baseline represents a backstop on all of that. Because even if you don't think of all the different ways in which you're doing something different from business as usual, you measure it, and what that does is that measurement gives you the ability to basically bring in a number of factors that you can't quantify on the front end. And because you're doing that simple comparative approach, it gives you a strong basis for judging that additionality or that impact above and beyond the baseline. So baselines are quite complicated. They're especially complicated in forests where you're doing a lot of harvest, and you have to model, essentially the harvest cycles and the regrowth cycles in different places and have that be appropriate to the place you're doing the project.
Thank you. I found that helpful, and I hope our audience did too. I wanted to switch to methodology. Does it require a credit developer to plan for specifically healthy forests? For example, not creating an overstocked forest that might be at higher risk for wildfires down the road. How much does it look at future risks?
Yeah, so in the methodologies, you have to basically say, okay, is this site subject to floods? Is it subject to fires, pests, pathogens, even like geologic activities, earthquakes, volcanoes? And so you have to go through a checklist and use data that they provide or that you can, provide from studies and justify. And in that, you develop that risk buffer that we talked about with Laura, where you're saying, okay, I know I'm in a place that has high fire risk, so we're going to have a larger buffer. In terms of the forest characteristics, you're incentivized to plant a forest that's more resilient because you're only getting credits for what's documented growth. So if you're stocking a bunch of seedlings in there and you've got high mortality and you've got, a sick, unhealthy, overstocked forest, that's just coming out of your pocket because you're not able to generate credits because those trees aren't growing. So you're basically incentivized to optimize the growth of the forest. And that's where people, will put in eucalyptus and other trees, but increasingly standards and buyers are requiring that you have something that's more like ecological restoration, less like a tree plantation. So yeah.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, definitely.
Matt, do we have time for one more question, or should we wrap up for the day?
I would love to ask a lot of these questions, but I think we probably need to close. Thanks so much, Dick.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. So thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed our time together with Dick Cameron. This webinar will be available later on our website within the next day at sempervirens.org. We hope you can join us next month in September with one of our favorite guests, Jane Kim, who is an artist and newly appointed Forest Fellow at Sempervirens Fund. She will be talking with us from her home base, Inkdwell in Half Moon Bay, about many of the projects she's working on and her artwork in creating a series centered on redwoods, redwood rings, fire, and the plants and wildlife of redwood forest. So thank you again to our sponsored Heritage Bank of Commerce and Sharp Investments. We are grateful for their ongoing support. And thank you to all of you who joined us today for Under the Redwoods.